We're good.
Okay, and here we go in three, two, one. And we're back. It's Neil Larson along with Julie Mason from News Talk 1079. And Julie, we've been asked to moderate this forum today.
Yeah, a little unconventional for us, but there was some difficulty getting all of the candidates together. So we agreed to invite two of the candidates here from Legislative District 30. So we welcome you to the studio, Julianne Young and David Cannon.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you so much, Julie. It's a pleasure to be here.
We should note David's joining us via Zoom he had a little at work, a commitment that he had to make, but we appreciate you making some time. So let's just go ahead and give each of you a minute or two to talk about your campaign and why you're running for re-election. Go ahead, Julianne.
All right. Thanks, Neil. So I'm a no nonsense, get her done, mama bear kind of girl. And 6 years ago, I decided to jump in and run for the legislature. I have loved serving. We've been able to be very effective and accomplish a lot of things that have made life better for ordinary folks in Idaho and for families. We've done a lot to protect kids, property rights, a whole variety of other issues. I've loved the chance to serve and just looking forward to continuing.
All right, David, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Neil. Yeah, I've been serving for 4 years now. I kind of have a passion for the pocketbook issues, so to speak, lower taxes and reining in big government. We've been successful in the 4 years that I've been serving at returning people's money to them in the form of tax rebates and so forth, and lower income tax rates and some property tax relief in the last couple of years. And those are kind of the issues that I have a passion for. I'm excited to continue my work, particularly as chairman of the Rev and Tax Committee, in terms of just, conservative values and traditional values in terms of smaller government and lower taxes. And so I'm excited to continue serving in that capacity.
All right. We do want to note that the opponents in this race, they were invited and just were not able to be here today and declined to be a part of today's forum, but they have been invited to be here. Julianne Young, your opponent, of course, is Ben Furman. David, your opponent is Josh Sorensen. So let's actually start with a question that I think is kind of cuts to the division that we have in the Republican Party today. We've kind of been watching what's happening with the emergence of the Main Street Caucus, and I'm sure that's a group that both of you are familiar with. It's hard to tell exactly if your opponents will be aligned with that. When I asked Ben Furman in studio a few weeks ago, he was kind of ambiguous whether or not he would be a part of it. Didn't say he had any initial intention to become a part of that group. However, he is campaigning very closely with Josh Sorensen. Josh Sorensen's boss is Mike Simpson, and Congressman Simpson seems to be very involved in the emergence of the Main Street Caucus. So maybe talk about the emergence of this group and how you're reading that and the level of influence they have in Idaho politics. Go ahead, Julianne.
All right. Thanks, Neil. Main Street Caucus is kind of a new thing this last session, although I would say it did begin last session with the East Idaho Caucus. I believe that's rolled into the Main Street Caucus. But I think kind of the big picture takeaway is that this is the most liberal floor that I have ever served with this last year. They went left from their first year. A lot of these Main Street Caucus members are freshmen. And I remember a comment from Brent Crane, who's been there for, I don't know, maybe 18 years, long time. And he made a similar comment. This is the most liberal floor that he has ever served with. So definitely a shift to the left. I see a lot of coordination with the Democrats, more than I would ever be comfortable with as an individual or as a legislator. And I just think it's a dynamic that people ought to pay attention to.
Right. David, why don't you weigh in on that?
Yeah, thank you. I don't want to put words in my opponent's mouth or say that he's going to be a part of that group. What I will say is that that group tends to kind of vote along with Democrats, and there's kind of a division between what I term conservative Republicans and on the one side, and on the other side, the Main Street Caucus Republicans joining with Democrats. I won't put words in my opponent's mouth, but I will say he's kind of attacked me on about 4 or 5 pieces of legislation and votes that I've taken. And I've done a little bit of legwork and research. And in every one of those cases, my vote was consistent with the majority of Republicans. And his position would be consistent with a sliver of the Republican Party, mainly Main Street caucus Republicans, and with unanimous support from the Democrat Party. So take that for what it's worth, but his positions and his attacks on me are for votes that I've taken that are solidly with the majority of the Republican caucus.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's continue with that thought process there, David. You mentioned some of those attacks. Let's just be clear about what they are. You can state your side of it. If there has been an attack, this is your chance to, at least give your position in that. So extend the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. So 2 or 3 examples. One would be the Child, School, and Library Protection Act. That's where we're trying to remove inappropriate, sexually explicit content from our libraries, or at least from the children's sections of those libraries. In that case, the vote on the House floor with regard to that bill was like 47 in favor of the bill, and I was in favor of that, to 23. Those 23 votes consist of 11 Democrats and 12 of our most liberal Republicans. My opponent has come out attacking me for that vote, and he's in the camp of those Democrats and liberal Republicans. The other day, he launched an attack on me for a rate-regulated utilities bill that I sponsored, and he said that it would be a tax increase when it really wouldn't. He said it would be a tax increase relative to electricity rates and so forth. And I thought that was disingenuous on a couple of counts. One is it would not have been a tax increase. It would be a neutral deal. And the reason that I was interested in doing it is it would actually lead to less litigation, because it would change the way that utilities pay taxes from a property tax approach to a kilowatt hour tax approach, but it would be neutral in terms of the taxes that would be charged. But the thing that I found super, I guess, disingenuous or hypocritical about that is that my opponent has been in favor of and has been canvassing the state for the last 3 years in favor of breaching our dams on the rivers and basically changing the ag industry, the ag economy, and frankly, our way of life. And to point at me and say that I'm trying to raise taxes on electricity rates while he's campaigning to try to eliminate hydropower from the dams, that would be what would cause electricity rates in Idaho to skyrocket. And so that attack is somewhat hypocritical. I mention that because on the House floor, we have actually on 2 occasions during the last 4 years voted on a resolution to voice our opposition to the dam breaching scheme. Every single Republican on the House floor has been in favor of that resolution in opposition to the dam breaching scheme. And the Democrats, by and large, oppose that resolution and are in favor of the dam breaching scheme. And that's another example of him being out of touch with Republican values and lining up with liberal values instead.
One of the things that I do want to follow up on this dam breaching issue, David, is, I mean, he's in a unique situation because he does work for Congressman Simpson and is probably expected to advocate for that position. Has he been silent about that issue in the context of his own campaign to be a part of the legislature?
To my knowledge, and again, I don't know what he said at his town halls and so forth, but to my knowledge, he's avoided that and even downplayed his role in that. However, there's no getting around that he has in the last 3 years been canvassing hard for that. I've located some commissioner meeting minutes which show him making the case for the dam breaching. I've talked to several people who say that they've talked to him and that he has been advocating for breaching the dam. So again, I don't know everything that he says in his campaign, but I know that for the last 3 years, he's been lobbying hard to try to get that change, which would be a drastic change for Idaho and particularly for the ag community. I know that when this scheme came out, I mean, Farm Bureau voiced a warning and said, we are adamantly opposed to this. It would undermine everything that is Idaho agriculture.
All right. You're listening to a forum on News Talk 1079 with Representatives Julianne Young and David Cannon from Legislative District 30. Julianne, I think this would be a good opportunity since David talked about his opponent and clarifying some of the accusations against him. There's some things you want to set the record straight on that you've been accused of.
Sure. Thank you, Neil. You know, it's interesting because our two opponents have been running as a slate, and the library bill has been an issue for both of them, which again is their arguments are Democrat arguments. They're not consistent with what the mainstream Republican Party on the state level is saying by any stretch. But the other thing that I think has been challenging is that a lot of these conversations are happening on a one-on-one basis. You know, him and whoever's listening to him, no forum where there's back and forth and civil discussion. And so a lot of things that are being said are the Democrat arguments. They're inaccurately representing the bill, but there's no one there to challenge it. And I think that's got to be really confusing and frustrating for voters to not have that opportunity. We did get a brief moment at the Chamber of Commerce Forum where I circled back to address some of those untruths, honestly, about what the legislation did and didn't do. But that's the extent of it. And I just feel like, first of all, if that's going to be the primary reason that someone runs for office, they'd better know what it says. Yeah. And in addition to that, they'd better be straight with voters about what it says. Because if somebody's not going to shoot straight with you and tell you the truth about the legal facts when we're dealing with issues, that's a real problem.
Well, I did interview Ben, and we actually talked quite extended about this library bill. He has a personal interest. I guess his mother-in-law is a librarian, and took some issue with the library bill. But the truth is there. His position is actually the Democrat position. A vast majority of Republicans voted for the library bill. The governor signed the bill. And so I guess speak to that particular dynamic of your opponent.
Certainly. So I think you can't forget that the bill itself is being misrepresented as he talks to people. So in the Chamber of Commerce Forum, he said, for example, there is no definition of what is harmful to minors. There's a whole page of definitions in the bill. You define the words in the definition. It's that detailed. And then he also said, and it's not a good bill because it doesn't force them to move it, which it clearly does. And so there's just a lot of misinformation going on. But I think if I could circle back around, too, just to kind of touch on this pattern that we're seeing, some of the other attacks that have been leveled are situations where he likes the word consistently. Representative Young consistently votes against, and then you fill in the blank, right? And that's always followed by a long list of bills. And so, again, like Dave, I did my homework. I looked up the bills, and what I find is that the majority of Republicans voted against those bills, as did I. And these are, in most of these instances, not even bills that are really about the core subject that he's talking about. So, for example, I consistently vote against law enforcement, and there's a list of 11 bills. Only one was actually an Idaho State Police budget. The other budgets are an Office of Drug Policy budget that had that disastrous needle exchange program in it. It's AG budgets. It's budgets that had huge increases, but they're not ISP budgets with the exception of one, which was a supplemental appropriation that was non-emergent. And I always vote against those because what we're talking about here is an accounting shell game where you hide the spending from the public. So it doesn't matter to me which budget it is. If it's a non-emergent supplemental, I'll vote no.
Yeah.
So that gets lost in translation. But then you add to that the fact that the majority of Republicans also voted no on these, and that several of them died on the floor. They had so little support. And basically what he's saying is, if you elect me, I'll vote yes. I'll vote yes on all of these. I'll vote yes for that disastrous needle exchange program. I'll vote yes for the 50% or 100% increase in the budgets. I'll vote yes for the supplementals. But voters don't know that. All they see is this big long list of numbers, and there's no opportunity for direct conversation about it.
One of the things that I've seen in his, oh, go ahead, David.
Neil, I was going to jump in, and I had a couple thoughts come to my mind. Going back to the Child School and Library Protection Act bill, my mother was on the library board for several years, and after she finished her stint there, my wife was on the local library board for several years, and they are both in favor of this bill. And I would say it's kind of a misleading thing to say that we're attacking libraries and librarians. I've talked to a number of librarians who are in favor of the idea of them having tools to remove these inappropriate materials. I think sometimes it's hard for them to go public and say that because that's against the talking points that they've been given. But there are a lot of librarians out there who want the ability to screen these materials. I also wanted to jump in and mention that on the attacks that I've been receiving on a public safety front, the inference, and it's not explicitly stated, but the inference is that I voted against the fentanyl bill, the mandatory minimum fentanyl bill, and that's simply not the case. I voted for the fentanyl bill to advance it out of committee, and then I voted for it again on the House floor. And so, the inferences that I have been soft on public safety issues just aren't there, and I wanted to set the record straight on those two fronts.
One other issue that's come up, thank you, David, is the Idaho Freedom Foundation. I know Ben has been talking about that in his campaign and trying to link you to the IFF. But if you look at your score, you're solid. I think there's 3 metrics there, and I think you're solid, certainly in the first one. But when it comes to spending, I think you're down the list a ways. So maybe talk to that. I don't know if it's an accusation or the claim that he's making about your connection with the IFF.
Okay, so first of all, nobody belongs to the IFF, whatever that is, right? Yeah. They're a group, they rate bills, they have a metric. I vote my district. And so that's one of the reasons that you'll see that maybe on their spending index, I'm a little lower than some because I look at spending bills and I think, okay, how does my district feel about this? And what would be my justification for voting no on this bill? And if I feel comfortable that this is a bill that my district would be supportive of me voting no, then that's how I vote. But nobody belongs to them. They're one voice among many. And I guess there's an interesting dynamic here that I think we'll get to in a minute where we just stereotype and label and try to discredit people as well. And I'm not saying that I agree with everything that the Freedom Foundation does, because clearly I don't always vote the way that they might suggest that I vote. But what I am saying, too, is that everybody has a right to have a voice in the public forum. And so they have a voice, Farm Bureau has a voice, IACI has a voice. And I don't think that there needs to be this tribalism in terms of that group is not okay. Yeah. They can just be another voice. And why do we need to label and demean?
Yeah, they're either good or evil or something. We've kind of created a lot
right.
Of
it's
that.
not Star Wars.
Yeah,
there's no Darth Vader. There's
yeah, good point.
It's just real life.
David, do you want to weigh in on this dynamic?
Me personally, and I don't think anyone has really come out and accused me of being part of the Freedom Foundation per se. So I don't feel like I need to defend myself against that accusation. And I also just agree. I mean, I look at issues based on a case-by-case basis, and there are some issues. I mean, I align with the Freedom Foundation in some things. They're pretty passionate about limiting government, and that's one of my passions. They're passionate about not blowing up budgets, and I'm passionate about not growing the government, at high rates and so forth. But I made a conscious decision when I began serving that I was not going to join any quote unquote sub-caucus within the Republican Party. I just think that it limits your ability to have a voice. I don't want to be a rubber stamp. I want to be able to advocate for my constituents, who I view as my quote unquote special interest group. And I don't want to be limited in any way, shape, or form as I do that. So I made a conscious decision not to join any sub caucus within the Republican Party. And to this day, I think that that's a better approach than is, joining with these groups within the group, so to speak.
All right, let's move on to a different conversation. We've seen several of, I think, what you guys have characterized as people closer to the left, or maybe aligning more with Democrats. They're invoking a phrase called Reagan's Big Tent, and they're calling themselves Reagan conservatives. I would like each of your takes on that campaigning concept that Reagan's Big Tent means everyone should be involved, and how would you actually define Reagan's Big Tent? So why don't you go ahead and take it first, Julianne?
Certainly. Thanks so much. So here's the thing. A tent has boundaries still. And when you read Reagan's Big Tent speech when he became the governor of California, he says within our tent are people who share core values. And he talks about what those core values are, that the people don't work for the government, but that the people support the government so that they can work for themselves. And all of these fundamental principles about what's the proper role of government and how do we see that playing out, those are core Republican values that he identified. But he said within this tent, we're going to protect these values. We're going to work together to advocate for these values. Sometimes we're going to disagree on the methods that we might use. Sometimes we're going to disagree about who's in the leadership positions. But we have to always remember that our primary commonality of those values is more important than these other things that we might disagree on. And we have to set those disagreements aside in favor of our principles. What I hear people arguing when they use the big tent analogy to justify open primaries is, we're going to get rid of the boundaries. We're going to throw the doors open. We're going to welcome everyone in, regardless of whether they share our values or not. And then why have a tent at the end of the day, right? So we can't be pulled into thinking that a big tent means no tent.
Yeah. They want Woodstock, right?
David, would you like to respond to Reagan's Big Tent?
Yeah, I'd like to just give a shout out to Ronald Reagan. He's one of my heroes. I think that what I'll say about Ronald Reagan is that there are a couple things that really inspire me. One is he famously said something along the lines, I won't get this quote exactly right, I'll paraphrase, but he said, sometimes the answer isn't government, sometimes government is the problem. And, to me, there's a real bright line between people in the Republican Party who believe that the answer to our problems always is government and more government and new government programs and bigger government programs. And I feel like I'm with a group that is desperately trying to fight for this idea that Ronald Reagan championed, that no, we've got to put our faith in people. We've got to put our faith in families. We've got to put our faith in free markets and small business and so forth. And we can't put our faith always in the government. And the other thing I'll say is, just from a standpoint of just the American dream, I always used to look at Ronald Reagan and be inspired by his optimism and his American dream for the people. And I look now, and we're at a crossroads between people who want government to get out of the way so that they can achieve their American dream, and people who want to have a new American dream where it is to be handed things by the government. And it's a dangerous path to go down. We need to restore the American dream, that is government getting out of the way for people to work hard and enjoy the benefit and the fruits of their labor.
All right. Thank you for that, David. Let's shift and talk about some specific legislation that I want you guys to talk about. If you were to pick two bills that you've worked on that you're really passionate about, that you're proud of, maybe the bill became law or almost became law, And then we want to ask you about the work yet to do in the coming legislative sessions. What would you like to see? So, Julianne, if you're ready, I know it's kind of a lot there to ask of you. So maybe you want to do one right now, and then David can answer whatever you'd like. It doesn't.
You know
matter.
what? You're killing me because I don't want to just pick two.
They're like children, right?
I know. I know. I'm going to just talk about two, and then maybe I'll squeeze another one in later. How's
Sure.
that?
Yeah, you can sneak one in. That's fine.
Okay. So maybe I'll just talk first about one that I worked on for a couple of years for Idaho counselors. We have a situation right now in the state of Idaho where counselors are being told that if they don't affirm somebody's transition, then they can lose their license or be sued. And it's really having a big impact on people wanting to be counselors. It's having an impact on parents who are trying to find a good counselor for their child, for example, because the counselor's afraid to tell them what they think. They don't want to be the cake baker. And we had a fantastic team of counselors. This legislation took several years to get passed, but I think it's the first step in protecting religious freedom and freedom of conscience for other medical practitioners as well. And it was a really big win this last session. And then another one that I'll talk about really quick is the annexation bill. So Idaho was one of the only states in the nation that still allowed unilateral forced annexation by a city out in the impact area. Up to 100 lots with no notice, no hearing, and no consent. Most cities weren't doing it, but there were a handful that were doing it. And in addition to that, our statute was incredibly outdated and confusing and causing a lot of legal conflict, especially in my district and in Idaho Falls. And so we cleaned that up. That was a 4-year process. It was a huge fight during the legislative session. We actually had to bring it back from the dead once, which was very dramatic and exciting, but super great to see it get done. And that one was great, too, because it was a team effort within our district. Dave and Julie Van Orden and myself were all involved in it. Barbara Ehart was a huge help, as was Doug Ricks in the Senate. And that was a huge win for property owners. And then my last little tiny one is the definition of male and female, which I think is super important and foundational to so many other things that need to be done in the state of Idaho.
I'm going to nickname it the Lazarus Bill from here on out.
Yes, it was resurrected. Julianne, give us just a little more detail on the male-female language bill.
Yeah. So I kind of jumped into this issue my second year as a legislator because the birth certificate ruling had just been handed down and the state of Idaho was being required to record gender identity on birth certificates, not biological sex. So I jumped in on that issue my second year. We got a bill passed. We had an activist judge who did not rule on the constitutionality of that bill, but still put an injunction in place on the legislation based on his ruling, which was before the legislation was passed. So I think that's an ultimate act of judicial activism right there. And it just kind of opened my eyes to how many things in our state really are impacted by our understanding of male and female. And I think as a woman, there are so many protections that I've just grown up with that I take for granted, that I can have a private restroom, that I can go to a locker room, that I can play on a sports team, and there's a measure of protection for me. But those things are no longer givens. And so the bill this year went beyond the initial birth certificate bill, which distinguished between biological sex and gender identity. And now it said, not only is biological sex a factual scientific category, but here's what male is, and here's what female is.
Okay. David, go ahead and pick your 3 favorite legislative children now.
Thank you, Neil. Appreciate that. I'll start with a bill that I co-sponsored. It's Senate Bill 1350. And by way of background, the reason this is important to me is one, the law enforcement community had one of its priorities going into the session as public safety push, cleaning up or giving ourselves better tools to deal with the scourge that is human trafficking. And that's really, my eyes have been opened in the last session or two at testimony that we've heard in various committees about the widespread problem in the state of Idaho that human trafficking is. This is also important to me because of the fact that I'm a defense attorney and I actually have a public defender contract with Bingham County. And under that contract, I represent the juveniles in our county in juvenile court. And anyway, Senate Bill 1350 is a reworking of the protocol in juvenile court to allow for us to look for red flags that kind of highlight kids that are at high risk of human trafficking, and then do kind of a deep dive and see if those issues are going on. And if so, we can get them the help that they need in that system. So that would be one thing that I'm super proud of, and I think was a priority of law enforcement and a priority of all of us who are interested in public safety. And I think that Senate Bill 1350 is a great step in the right direction for dealing with the human trafficking problem. I'll point next to House Bill 521, which was our big school facilities fund bill. And I call it a property tax relief bill too. I think that 2 years ago, we as the legislature started looking at property tax and property tax relief. That's kind of a harder lift for us than is, income tax relief or sales tax relief, because property taxes are not collected by the state and they aren't spent by the state. And so it's a little harder to figure out how to do property tax relief. However, we've come up with some creative ways to do that, and that really has its the key to that has been to take state funds and pay for things that historically have been paid for by local taxpayers through property taxes. And in House Bill 292 last year, we started paying for school facilities and reducing local folks' property tax obligations by doing that. And we doubled down on that approach in House Bill 521 this year. And I love it because it accomplishes two things that I think are super important. One, it helps us to provide our public schools with the facilities that they need and that we're constitutionally required to do. But two, while we're doing that, we can achieve property tax relief and give back some of this money that has been over collected over the last several years, and kind of rein in government and put money back in people's pockets where it belongs. So those are the bills that I would point to, Neil. Thank you for the question.
All right.
All right, we're running short on time. So real quick, each one of you, what are you looking forward to doing in the 2025 legislative session? And that just sounds so weird that I said 2025.
Yeah.
That really did. So what are you looking forward to doing in the 2025 legislative session?
Oh boy, Julie, it's almost like asking a lady if she's going to have a baby when she just finished being in labor.
Forget the pain that you just experienced, Julianne.
No, there are a lot of exciting things that we're going to continue to work on. But I'll tell you, one of the biggest things that I'm concerned about right now is water. Honestly, I see a lot of potential for some great proactive solutions that can help us maximize the available supply so that we have to rely on curtailment less. And I think that's absolutely critical. So we're going to be working on that all through the summer, I'm sure. And hopefully we get some progress this next year, because it's just too hard for our ag community to constantly be in limbo, wondering, do I plant a crop? Do I not plant a crop? And the way things are going, it doesn't look good.
Yeah. Okay. David.
Thank you again. One of the victories that I think we had this past year was the new approach to budgeting that was championed by Chairman Horman, Wendy Horman. And that was a change that was very much a hard-fought victory. There was a lot of opposition to that change, and the change provided us with tools for reining in big government spending and also for transparency. And I think anytime you're shining a light on things and becoming more transparent, it's a win for the people of Idaho. And anytime you're reining in government, it's a win for the people of Idaho. I plan to, as chairman of House Rev and Tax, to kind of follow the lead of Chairman Horman, and I'd like to bring some bills and some legislation that brings transparency to our tax process and reins in big government in that way.
Okay. For just to be upfront, we have 3.5 minutes left on our Zoom call before it disconnects. So, David, we're going to have you give your final minute and a half or so. You make your closing argument to the voters on why they should vote and reelect David Cannon.
Thank you, Neil. Yeah, I'm going to go back to just for illustrative purposes. I'm going to go back to this dam breaching scheme that my opponent has been floating, and I want to talk about the price tag of that. That was a $33 billion scheme, and that's, I look at that as a lot of money, and I feel like sometimes that as he's been working for the last 6 years, kind of in a setting of the federal government, I think sometimes people that work in a federal government setting kind of lose track of these figures and what they mean. We in Idaho have a constitutional provision that requires us to have a balanced budget. On a federal level, we don't. And so, the $33 billion that it would cost to breach the dams would add only, and I use that in quotation marks, and I'm kind of paraphrasing what my opponent might say, but only 0.1% of what our existing federal debt is already. And sometimes I think that people are looking at spending money like this and thinking, heck, it doesn't matter to us. We'll never have to pay it back. It'll be our kids and our grandkids. And I'm taking the stand here that we don't want to take cues from Washington, D.C. about how to run Idaho. We want to set the example in Idaho and show Washington, D.C. how things should be. And that's what a vote for Cannon represents.
All right, David, really quick, what is your website?
Oh, man. CannonForIdaho.com.
Okay, CannonForIdaho.com. I'll edit that and make it sound pretty. But so
thank you.
David, if we lose you during Julianne's closing comments here, thank you for your participation. And Julianne, we'll turn it to you.
Thanks, Neil. I think I'd just like to say that I absolutely have loved serving. And I feel like I've been effective. In fact, I feel pretty comfortable saying I'm one of the most effective legislators in the legislature in terms of actually getting things done. And part of that is because I'm a team builder. And I know that my opponent has really thrown out there this idea that the Republican Party is in chaos and people need to elect him in order to bring some sense of reason. And that's just not my experience at all. In fact, I find the environment in Boise and the things that we've been able to accomplish to be incredibly functional, especially when you compare it to what's been happening in our local Central Committee, where my opponent plays a prominent role. So just as you said now, we don't want to bring federal politics to Idaho. I'm not sure we want what's happening in our local Central Committee sent to Boise either. In fact, I think that we have an awesome track record that ought to be supported. I know that we're going to continue advocating for fiscally conservative policies. I know that we're going to continue advocating for the family. We're going to be doing the things that help real people in real time, and we're actually going to be getting the work done instead of fueling more conflict on the state level, which is what happens when you have this tribalism and the Main Street Caucus versus the Freedom Foundation and all of that garbage that goes on. I just really want to see good things happen for the people of District 30, and I'm happy to serve.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there. And Julianne, your website.
youngforidahohouse.com.
Okay. Want to thank both of you for being a part of this. Thank you.